Hey there everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first novel. And on my channel I like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of all writing, and that is the characters. And the heart of the characters is their psychology. So that is the angle I like to take with everything we talk about on my channel. So today I wanted to do a little discussion, not necessarily a trope diagnosis or anything like that, but just a discussion of a topic that I struggled a little bit with when I first got into writing. And it actually took me a while to kind of get a grasp on it. So I want to talk about active versus passive characters. So within the writing community as a whole, you will usually hear you want your main character to be an active character. And for the most part, that's true. But I think people kind of get hung up in the terminology and stuff. So I want to try and make it a little more understandable, because I had people explain this to me multiple times before I really got it. And one of the ways I got it was comparing it to movies and shows that I knew. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to use Disney because I think Disney is something most people are very familiar with. And I also think that this question reflects an interesting shift in their movies over time. So the bare bones definition: an active character is a character that takes action to move the plot along, so their actions directly affect the plot. A passive character is someone that the plot kind of pulls them along with it, but they don't really take action that directly impacts the plot, so to speak. And I think it's a mistake, honestly, to consider a character is ever 100% active, 100% passive, because an active character will have passive actions. A passive character can occasionally have active actions, but we're talking like overall, so to speak. So the reason I brought up Disney is if you look at their older movies, like I'm talking golden age to like the 70s. Yeah, I'll go with that. From about the golden age to about the 70s. Most of their main female protagonists are very passive because that was kind of the thing. There really wasn't, we hadn't really hit that drive of making the women more independent, more active in their own story. So the characters, for the most part, were fairly passive. For instance, Snow White, very first one. I still love this movie. I do. I still love it. Snow White is not the reason I love it, though. um, she just kind of is there. I mean, she is nice. She sings. She has her dreams of falling in love, but she doesn't really take any action to make that happen. The most active thing she does, I believe, is when the huntsman refuses to kill her and tells her to run away. She does. She runs away. Um, but that's kind of the end of it. I mean, she runs into the dwarves. She interacts with the dwarves. But the rest of the story is primarily driven by the villain's plot, the evil queen's plot. And then when she succeeds in said plot, it's the dwarves that drive a lot of the rest of the climax because they come back to try to save Snow White. But Snow White is just kind of there. Like I said, I don't hate the character, but she's not the reason I like the movie. I like the movie because of the queen and the dwarves, the active characters. Um, Cinderella, very similar scenario, although not to the same extent as Snow White. There is more focus on Cinderella, but again, she doesn't really take action to change things. The most that she does is she does decide she wants to try to go to the ball, but if her animal friends hadn't made the dress for her, she wouldn't have been able to. And once her dress is ripped, she runs off just to kind of cry and try to process this horrible situation. The fairy godmother shows up, gives her the means to go, and then she goes. Even at the end of the story, when she's been locked away in her room, it's her animal friends that get her out. She calls to them for help. She does shout, which is more than Snow White does, but it's still her animal friends that kind of carry that. So I consider her to be one of those characters that shifts between passive and active. Like, you can tell they were trying to be a little more active with her, but she's still mainly a passive character. Most of the plot is driven by the things that her animal sidekicks do to try to help her. So her sidekicks are more of the active characters in that story, even through to the end. Now, I will bring up the two sequels. I'm going to talk about them later, but just so you guys know, I have not forgotten about them, and I actually have a good point to bring up with them. And then after Cinderella, you get to, I believe the next princess one is Sleeping Beauty, which is my favorite Disney movie, period. But again, it's not because of Aurora. Aurora's probably the most passive of all the princesses, I think. I think she has 14 lines of dialogue in the whole movie. I mean, she grows up with the fairies in the cottage in the woods. She goes out, she talks about dreams that she's having of someone coming along, and she falling in love, getting married. She sings, she dances, she gets upset when she finds out she's actually the princess, and then she's put under the spell till she wakes up at the end, and then she and Prince Philip get married. So she really doesn't do much. She's there, and the plot happens to her. Everything, she's what I would call the focus, but she's not the center point, I guess. Let me put it this way. I think there is a very, very good argument that Aurora is the focus of the story, but she is not the main character. The main character, in my mind, are the fairies and Philip, because they drive everything. Philip he's not the most active male lead. That comes a little later, but he is more active than the ones we've had before. I mean, he is directly impacting the plot by going to Aurora's cottage, by getting kidnapped, and then he does fight Maleficent. He doesn't say anything. The last line in this movie that he has is "Goodbye, Father." Rest of the movie, he grunts, he makes noises, but he doesn't say anything. So he's active in a physical sense, but not so much a character development sense. The fairies, on the other hand, I would argue, are very much the viewpoint of this story, in my mind. They're there from the very beginning through to the end. And it's them we get to know. It's them that we see interact with one another in the environment. It's them that we see interact with what the villain does. In my mind, the fairies are the main characters of this movie. I know that Philip and Aurora are generally cited as such. I don't think that's true. Because a main character is generally the person that you follow through a story. They are the viewpoint. And in Sleeping Beauty, that is definitely the fairies. The fairies are the viewpoint. So in my mind, I think people, when they say that the main characters are boring in Sleeping Beauty, I think maybe we should reevaluate who really is the main character. Then I think in the 70s, no, not, yeah, in the 70s you get Robin Hood, which has Maid Marian in it. She's not a main character, but she is in it. She, again, is one of those that I think falls into the, isn't entirely completely passive, but she's not active either. Interestingly, in the original draft, she was supposed to be more active. She was supposed to, after the showdown at the archery tournament, she was supposed to stay with Robin Hood and help his men break people out of prison, and she was much more involved. But they cut that out. Why, I still am not entirely sure, but they cut it out. But we do see her being active in the sense that she does become involved when it involves Robin. So she's partially active, but she still doesn't impact the plot a ton. I mean, you could take her out of the story and you would maybe have to do a couple of edits, but she's mainly there as a driving point for Robin. And she's not even really his main driving point. I still think his main driving point is helping the people. She's just kind of the cherry on top. Um, but then after the 70s, we get into the 80s and the 90s. And that's really when you start to see this shift from the more passive female characters to more active. This is where we get into Jasmine, Ariel, Belle, and then obviously up to the modern day Tiana, Moana, Rapunzel, all these characters that actively drive their plot. Moana makes the choice after her grandmother passes away to take the heart of Tefiti and go and find Maui. She actively makes that choice and she does it. If you take her out, there is no plot. Same thing with Tiana. She is very active. She is the one who is driving the whole story because she starts off the story with this dream to get her own restaurant, and that is her focus. Even after she gets turned into a frog, her focus is to find a way to turn back for her restaurant. So her decisions are actively driving this story along. And Jasmine, I will make the argument that Aladdin is Aladdin's movie. It is not Jasmine's movie. I don't think I really need to make that argument, but there seems to be some confusion over that as of late. But Aladdin is Aladdin's movie. Jasmine is there and she is a very active character, but it's not her movie. So it's Aladdin that's really driving the plot. Belle, on the other hand, is definitely what I would call an active character in that she is the one who is deciding that she doesn't care what the village thinks. She's going to do her own thing. When she finds out her father's gone, she makes a decision to go find him. She makes the decision to trade places with him. And ultimately, she is the one who decides to go back to help the beast at the end of the movie. Ariel, again, I think is very active. She is the one who is, her desire for the surface world and her desire to learn more is what drives her decision, her choice to go seek out the Sea Witch and all the things that follow from that. So I would consider her a very active character. And I think that is really the shift in Disney, in that if you look at their older movies, all the active characters are the side characters. If you look at their modern day movies, all their active characters are the main characters, which I think is very interesting. Because I like them both. But like I said, I tend to like the older movies for the side characters, for the active characters. The newer movies, I tend to like them for the main characters. Again, the active characters. And remember I said earlier I was going to go back to the Cinderella sequels, and that's what I'm talking about right now. The Cinderella sequels, I think, are a great example of this because almost every single person I talk to prefers Cinderella in the sequels as opposed to the main movie. Because the sequels were made years later. I think the second one came out in 2002-ish. Third one came out a few years later, I think, 2005, 2006, something like that. That is a huge gap, and you can see it with how they characterize the characters. Cinderella in the second one, it's not a very good movie. I like some parts of it, but it's not a very good movie. But in the second one, she is more active than she was in the first one. She's the one who, she's rebelling against the palace rules about how a princess should act and what they should do. She makes the decision to go and help her stepsister, and things like that. The third movie, this is what I wish Cinderella had been the whole time. She is essentially in this situation where her fairy godmother's wand has been stolen and her stepmother has essentially undone her happily ever after. But instead of just sitting there and waiting for the plot to happen to her, she makes active decisions. She goes to the palace to serve as a servant to try and reach the prince. When she is sent away on a ship, she is trying to get back to him. When the spell and stuff is starting to wear off, she's making the choice to fight against it, try to get back and set her life straight again. So she is no longer just letting the plot occur to her. She is taking active steps to make the events happen. And I think, like I said, that's a really good example of just the difference between a passive and an active. If you look at Cinderella in the very first one, and then you look at her in the third movie, that I think is the best example of the difference between an active and a passive character. And like I said, I don't think passive characters are bad per se, but I do think that your main character should probably be active because they should be driving the plot. That doesn't mean they can't have periods where they are passive. In fact, I think that's probably just as important, because I think if you have a character that is active all the time and nothing else drives the plot forward, then it can get kind of stale and kind of predictable. But overall, they should be an active force. But I also want to throw this out there again, talking about Sleeping Beauty again. Like I said, I consider the fairies the main character in that story. So if you're in a situation where you're wanting to write a story and your main character keeps being a passive character, maybe consider, am I writing the right main character? I think a lot of times, especially in fantasy, we think we have to do it from the point of view of the prince or the princess or whatever. But there's lots of other viewpoints that I don't see done very much that I think can be just as interesting. Instead of the point of view of the princess, why don't we view, the rebellion from her chambermaid or her servant who is seeing the corruption on both sides? That, I think, is a fascinating viewpoint, but we don't see it very much. So I think that's just kind of my point with this discussion, is to consider, one, if you're writing the right main character, and two, what are they doing that makes the plot move? And if they're not doing anything, why not? Just some things to consider. Like I said, I like all the Disney movies just for different reasons. And it wasn't until I really started looking at their old movies and their new movies that I realized the reason I like all these movies are the active characters. It's just over time, who's the active character has shifted. And that's interesting. So thank you guys for chiming in and just listening to me babble about a topic for a little bit. If you guys like this kind of content, make sure you comment. I always love to respond to them. And make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss when I upload. I upload every Friday and every Sunday. And as always, if you guys have any suggestions, feel free to let me know either below or at any of the social media links I have. And until next time, I hope you guys have a good one.